What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos, I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if the true crime and makeup thing sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. Of course, there's bound to be some people who aren't down for the combination. If you happen to be one of those people, I have some links down in the description for you, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. So I'm sick again. How are you? Yes, this is the third time in like 6 weeks that I'm violently ill, but that's okay because I've got a belly full of Wingstop, a heart full of pure wonder, meaning that I can do anything, including sit here for an hour and talk with you about this piece of shit. Yes, today we're going to be diving into the horrendous story of Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton, a man whom, although known far and wide mostly as the pig farmer killer or the butcher, I personally like to refer to as the notorious PIG. That's a lie. I don't know why I've said that because I've literally never called him that a single time in my life before now. So that was a first for all of us. Anyways, before I get any further into the weeds, let me go ahead and extend a heartfelt thank you to Crystal for requesting this one. Not only is it a very interesting case, but without her request, we also never would have heard that notorious PIG joke. 2 birds, 1 stone. Am I right? So thank you, Crystal. Thank you for the request. Thank the rest of you for listening to my nonsensical, cold-fueled rambling. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into the story of Robert Pickton, the pig farmer killer. So, we're up north today, heading back to Canada.
Canada, you did it again.
Specifically, we're headed to a small city in British Columbia, located just about an hour east of Vancouver. Port Coquitlam sits on the north bank of where the Fraser River and the Pitt River meet, and then it is bisected by the Lougheed Highway and the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway. Known as POCO for short, Port Coquitlam sits on an 11 square mile plot of land, and it hosts a population of just under 70,000 people. Now, although POCO was originally developed as farmland, which will come heavily into play throughout today's story, according to the interwebs, nowadays POCO has been developed for suburban housing. The economy has diversified a lot in more recent decades, and it now hosts a variety of industrial and commercial developments. That said, though, even with some of the industrialization that has taken place in POCO, it does still have a ton of beautiful outdoor attractions. There are a multitude of different parks, there's museums, there's theaters. Honestly, coming from someone who's never seen it in person and knows very little about it, doesn't sound half bad. But even the best places in the world can produce some less than desirable folks. Enter Robert Pickton. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24th, 1949, in POCO to his pig farmer parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton. Robert was the second child born of the couple's 3 children, having been preceded in birth by his older sister Linda, and then followed by his younger brother David. Now, in any other scenario, I'd probably make some joke here about how it's no surprise that Robert was the middle child, given the fact that he grows up to be, crazy. We obviously all know the whole middle child stereotype. They're said to usually be the black sheep of the family, the outcasts, the troublemakers. One study I saw even found that middle children are 33% more likely to engage in nefarious activities in comparison to their siblings. And I don't know about y'all, but in my family, that absolutely tracks. However, I don't really know if we can attribute the monster that Robert grows up to be at all to his familial positioning. Yeah, he was technically a middle child, but he didn't really spend his adolescence being raised as such. Linda actually didn't even grow up under the same roof that Robert and David did. I guess their parents didn't think that a pig farm was a becoming environment to raise a young lady in. So rather than keep her there and risk whatever they were worried about, Leonard and Louise instead opted to send Linda off to live with relatives in hopes of giving her a more traditional and appropriate upbringing. And I'll tell you what, the more I learned about Leonard and Louise and this pig farm, y'all, Linda got the better end of that bargain. Because while she was off growing up like any other average little girl at the time, Robert and David, conversely, became farmhands at an incredibly young age. These two young boys were forced by their very own mother to work long and demanding hours, tending to livestock, all while forcing them to also neglect their own personal needs. Yeah, Louise, she was a cruel, cranky old bitch that cared more about her hogs than she did her own sons. She didn't even take time to make sure that her sons had their basic needs met. She also didn't take time to teach them to care for themselves in any sort of basic way. For example, personal hygiene. Yes, rather than launder their clothing or enforce an acceptable shower regimen, Louise instead allowed her children to go to school unbathed, unkempt, and in clothing that smelled like shit. As in literal shit, like manure. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, considering that Louise was apparently a pretty gnarly woman herself, but aren't you supposed to want better for your children? Louise definitely didn't, but just in general. Her poor sons were ridiculed and ostracized every day at school for the way that they would show up for class. The kids even eventually nicknamed Robert Stinky Piggy because of how disgustingly he would show up to school. But do you think that changed how Louise mothered her boys? Because I'll tell you, it didn't. As long as the farm chores were done and the livestock was taken care of, she did not give a tiny rat's ass about anything else that was going on in her children's lives. And this neglect, letting her kids be fucking disgusting, just walking around covered in pig shit all the time, it had some crazy long-term effects on our old buddy Robert. So even when he was old enough to develop his own personal hygiene routine and stick to it, it still took the pleading of people around him before he would finally decide to take a bath every once in a while. And all of this was because his mother just refused to be an actual functioning parent. I cannot stress to you enough how completely fucking disgusting this family was. And listen, I am on no high horse here. I am the first person to leave my house looking like I crawled out of a nearby sewer. I'm not vain, but I am clean. There's a difference. It is 1000% possible to not give a fuck about your appearance, but also to still be clean and hygienic. Low maintenance and dirty are not inherently the same. It wasn't even just their personal hygiene either. Their house was putrid too. Mind you, the first few years of Robert's life, they barely even had running water in the place. As he grew up, I am so surprised that given the diabolical viruses and diseases that the Pickton's petri dish of a home was undoubtedly festering, he must have just had the best immune system possible. And I guess good for him because things only got nastier and nastier as the Picktons allowed more and more of their literal farm animals to come and go from inside their house just as they pleased, just freely pissing and shitting everywhere. And then the Picktons, they would just live in it. The whole family was basically the joke of the town because they stuck out like sore thumbs. The area they lived in was relatively well off, and although the Picktons had money, they certainly did not behave like it. As a mother myself, I cannot even for half of a millisecond imagine allowing my children to grow up in conditions like this. And what's even worse is that knowing now how bad Louise was, guess what? Leonard was worse. He barely interacted with his children at all, which, sure, up front, sort of sounds better than Louise and her all work and no play attitude, but I assure you, it was not. On the off chance that one of the boys did find themselves face to face with their father, it was almost always for one of his just world-class beatings. They would barely ever see this man, like ever, and then randomly, out of the blue, he'd just turn up and beat the ever-loving shit out of them for who knows what. And then he'd disappear into the abyss again until the next time he would surface just to whoop one of their asses. Much like his blushing bride, he did not care even slightly about his children's upbringing. He didn't care about their feelings, and he certainly did not care about what horrific trauma he may be embedding into their DNA. Case in point, and I'm jumping forward just to squeech here with the story, but if you could, just stay with me for a second, okay? So when Robert was 12, because he didn't have a lot of friends, he spent all of his time with either his brother or one of the family's many farm animals, right? And so, just desperate beyond comprehension for a friend, a real, true friend of his very own. One weekend, Robert took all of the money that he had saved up in his little piggy bank. Oh my god, piggy bank. Hilarious. Sorry, that's not the point. He took all of the money that he had saved up for his entire 12 years of life. He brought it to a livestock auction, and he purchased his very own sweet, adorable little baby calf. And pretty much right away, Robert bonded deeply with this calf. He loved this thing, and he took care of it, and he doted on it. I mean, it was quite possibly the closest thing that he had ever had to a friend up to that point. So, as weird as it may sound to you or I, this calf was probably the most important thing in Robert's life. And full well knowing this, what do you think that Leonard did with said calf? Well, of course, he slaughtered it and left it hanging in the barn, bleeding out, for Robert to discover one day after school. Yeah, what the fuck? Just humor me for a second and imagine you're 12 and you come home from school to find your family dog strung up and bleeding out in the middle of your living room. Yeah, ain't nobody coming out of that experience normal. Of course, speaking pragmatically, I get it. It was a farm animal, and like it or not, that is typically the fate of a lot of livestock. Obviously, I'm not naive to that fact. However, I highly doubt that they truly had to slaughter the calf for any real reason other than cruelty. And two, you'd think that if they really did need to slaughter the calf, that there would at least be some sort of discussion about it first, some sort of warning, some sort of heads up that it was going to happen. You know, as a parent, there's a right way to do something, and then there's a wrong way to do something, and I doubt that I'm alone in my opinion that the way they went about this was very much the wrong way to have done so. Yeah, that's how Leonard parented. Just a real stand-up guy. Understandably, Robert was absolutely devastated and infuriated by this whole experience. He didn't speak to anyone in his family for days following the death of his calf. And even when Louise offered to pay him back for the calf, plus like 20 or 30 bucks extra, he didn't want anything to do with that either. Because it had never been about the money to Robert. It was about the camaraderie and the friendship that he had found with this calf, and the fact that it was just gone now for good. It had been stolen away from him unexpectedly by the two people that were supposed to protect him and love him. The two people that he should have been able to trust the most in the world. No wonder this man became a goddamn serial killer. It does help to show you, though, just how insensitive Mama Pickton was, because she figured that she could just throw money at this problem and it would go away. And Louise's moral shortcomings, they do not stop there. There was no such thing as consequences, as far as Louise Pickton was concerned. A wildly misguided philosophy that she then, I guess, felt should also extend to her darling, precious, Hills Have Eyes looking sons. Again, yes, I'm jumping around a smidge, but I promise you, this will all come together here in a minute. So let's jump to October 1967. What had happened was a young, wee, freshly 16 David Pickton, upon receiving his driver's license, decided to take one of his family's farm trucks and go on a little joyride. Fine, whatever. We've all been there. However, a place that hopefully none of us have been is seeing that joyride and in mowing down a completely innocent 14-year-old boy who was just minding his business, walking home. That is where David's joyride ended, though. Kinda. I mean, he certainly didn't stop and call authorities or render aid to this boy. No. Instead, he hightailed it the rest of the way back to the family farm, where Leonard then washed the blood off of the truck, and Louise, oh, Louise, she got into her own vehicle. She drove to the scene of the hit and run, where she found Tim injured, bleeding, and unconscious, just barely clinging to life. And seeing this, Louise rode him off of the road down a nearby embankment, where he landed in a small body of water and fucking drowned. He died. An autopsy later discovered that Tim had water in his lungs at the time of his death, meaning that while yes, he was severely injured when David hit him with the truck, technically he seems to have died at the hands of Louise, all because she couldn't let her precious little baby boy reap the consequences of his own stupid actions. Now, thankfully, when Leonard brought the truck to a mechanic to get the human-shaped fucking dent out of the hood, the mechanic felt like something incredibly suspicious was going on. So he called police, who, once Tim's body was discovered, well, suffice it to say that they didn't have to stretch to take the leap, right? Honestly, though, even after it was determined that David was responsible for what had happened to Tim, he still barely even received a slap on the wrist in return. I think he got a couple years of probation and he lost his license for a while. Doesn't seem nearly severe enough, but I'm sure Ma Pickton was ecstatic that her hillbilly little baby managed to skirt the law. Obviously, both Louise and Leonard sucked in their own demented ways. But knowing what you know, I'm sure you won't be surprised now to learn that as far as Robert was concerned, Louise was the lesser of the two evils. Actually, some sources say that Robert had an unhealthy, borderline obsessive relationship with his mother. And although I can't confirm that because I wasn't there, thank God, whatever the case may be though, I think we can all kind of deduce that the influence that Louise had on her sons, well, I don't think that it molded either of them into great people. Let's just say that. But narrowing things back down to Robert, as if he didn't have enough stuff stacked up against him, he was also, kind of stupid. Now, normally I would never phrase it like that. Just because a child struggles in school does not mean that they're stupid. But remember, Robert's a huge piece of shit, so he was stupid and I'm gonna call him stupid. He struggled a lot academically, and he was even held back somewhere as early as like second grade, I think. And while he did manage to eventually claw his way through elementary school as well as junior high, sometime throughout high school, Robert ultimately decided that formal education just was not for him. So he decided that instead he'd prefer to drop out and just head straight into the workforce. He officially left school sometime in 1963, meaning he was either 13 or 14 when he dropped out. And initially, to me, that sounds crazy, but all things considered, it doesn't really seem like he was headed anywhere great academically, so honestly, what's it matter in, the grand scheme of things? After dropping out of high school, Robert went on to secure a job at some sort of like meat processing plant outside of his parents' farm. I believe his official title was a butcher's apprentice or something along those lines. And while that may not sound super glamorous or dreamy to us, Robert actually turned out to be very comfortable in this position. He kept this job and stayed working at this plant for nearly 7 years before he then quit in order to return home to his family's farm in his early 20s. And despite the undoubtedly terrible memories that Robert had to have had from spending his childhood slopping pigs and tending to livestock, as an adult, he I guess, didn't really seem to have any problems doing this work. Sidebar, the farm that he was working on as an adult was different than the farm he'd been born on. The Picktons had moved from the original farm sometime right around when Robert had dropped out of school. Be it right before or right after, I couldn't tell you, but honestly, I really don't think that it matters all that much. At least it doesn't seem to have to Robert. Things from one farm to another don't really seem like they were all that different. If anything, things on the second farm might have been slightly worse than the conditions on the first, but I'm sure at some point you probably just really don't even notice that kind of thing anymore. When things are that bad, you're just in survival mode, like all the goddamn time. Now, that's not to say that they didn't bring some comforts from the first farm to the second. Don't worry, y'all. These fucking hillbillies quite literally towed their nasty, stank-ass, decrepit old farmhouse all the way from the first plot of land over to the second. I mean, we could not expect them to leave behind that gem.
It's a good quality item.
Anyway, I just wanted to clarify that it was the second farm that Robert went on to work on after leaving his butchering apprenticeship. And actually, it seems like this was the first time in his life where Robert finally kind of started to come into his own, relatively speaking, of course. Because don't get me wrong, he was still completely bizarre by anyone's standards. But he was definitely starting to try to branch out more and to meet more people and to be more social. From what I was able to gather, it seems like the main way that Robert did this, the main way that he tried to socialize, was through writing with various pen pals. How he came into contact with these pen pals, I couldn't even begin to venture a guess, but what I can tell you is that one of the most important pen pals in Robert's life undoubtedly was a woman named Connie Anderson. Through their correspondence, Connie and Robert actually connected so much and grew so close that in 1973, Robert packed up and he made the 36-hour, 2,500-mile trek from Port Coquitlam all the way to Pontiac, Michigan, to meet her in person. And you know what? I ought to hand it to Robert, because this meeting actually went incredibly well. It appears that they got along just the same in person as they had through their letters, and by the end of the 6 weeks that Robert stayed with Connie, the two were actually betrothed. Yes, reportedly, Robert left Port Coquitlam as a big old 24-year-old virgin, but he was coming back as a fiancé. Poor Connie, man. I mean, I don't know her, but I'd have to imagine that she could have done leaps and bounds better than this rat-faced fucking sack of pig shit. No, seriously, that's how people described Robert. Well, I added the sack of pig shit part, but for real, people did used to say that while David and Linda had inherited their mother's handsome genes, Robert, on the other hand, had inherited his father's rat face. Ew. That said, though, sadly, things between Robert and Connie would ultimately fizzle out over time when it became evident that neither of them seemed to care enough about the other to uproot their own lives to make their relationship work. And this was definitely a crushing blow for Robert. He always maintained that Connie was the love of his life, but no matter how much he loved her, he just could not leave his mom for her. I mean, the farm. He couldn't leave the farm for her. However, now that Robert had experienced the wonders of the touch of a woman, he definitely wasn't willing to give that up, and thus began his frequent soliciting of the services of Vancouver's women of the night. And given Robert's bottomless wallet and desperation for affection, he quickly became a favorite among these women. From wads of cash to drugs to basically whatever they wanted. Robert was there, he was willing, and he was more than able to foot the bill. And in taking these ladies out on the town, Robert started to socialize a lot more with all walks of life, from politicians to Hells Angels bikers. Robert was growing quite the eclectic group of acquaintances. And the more comfortable that he got with these women and with his new friends, the more forward he became. He gradually started requesting more and more from these ladies until eventually he was just brutalizing them and forcing them into doing whatever he wanted to do. And scarily, the more he pushed these limits, the more he seemed to enjoy himself. So then the next time he would push the limits even further. And as terrible and awful and just disgusting as that sounds in and of itself, like, just because these women are sex workers does not mean that they're at your mercy to do whatever you please. They're still entitled to their boundaries. They're still entitled to rescind their consent when you take it too far, you stank-ass hillbilly. But pushing the boundaries like he is at this point, it pales in comparison to the absolute horrors he would soon escalate to. And personally, I think that the pivotal turning point for Robert, the thing that took him from just this nasty hillbilly party boy over the edge to full-blown unhinged serial killer, it had to be the death of his mother. Although Papa Pickton passed away in 1978, which I'm sure affected Robert in some various nondescript ways, Leonard, unlike Louise, he was old and he'd been battling cancer for quite a while, so his death definitely had to have come as less of a blow. But Mama's death? Ooh. Yowza. We already know that Robert was way more attached to his mother than he ever was to his father. So then couple that with the fact that Louise passed away much younger and much more unexpectedly, girl, this sent him spiraling. Maybe not outwardly at first, but I wholeheartedly believe that Louise's passing had a very similar effect on Robert as Ed Gein's mother's passing had on him. You know, just with less nipple belts and human lampshades. Ooh, and my God, as if Robert wasn't enough of a ticking time bomb just as things sat right after Mama's death, cue her will. Obviously, the Pickton parents had a myriad of assets, which I assume the children figured would be split up pretty evenly. But while both David and Linda both received almost $90,000, as well as their fair share of the property, Robert, on the other hand, Louise's favorite, who literally waited on her hand and foot, nursing her through her own cancer right up until the very end, he, for whatever reason, received a fraction of what his siblings did. His siblings, who, mind you, were barely even affected by the fact that their parents had died. Following his mother's death, Robert got just $20,000 up front, and he got absolutely no land. The only way that he would have ever been entitled to any of the farmland was if he had remained living and working on it for an additional 10 years. So up until he was 40. Yeah, understandably, that one hurt. Him, not me. I don't fucking care. Don't worry though, because the blows didn't stop there. After Louise died, David ended up moving back onto the property and into the family's farmhouse, which in turn relegated old Bobby Boy to a quaint little trailer that he'd parked somewhere out on his now siblings' property. Ouch. Oh, and in case you're wondering, Linda, she took her money and she split. I don't know what, if any, contact that she maintained with either of her brothers following the death of her parents, but I can definitely tell you that she does not come up again within this story. And so, feeling completely betrayed and devastated by the loss of his mother and the fact that she had seemingly dicked him over via her estate, well, this seems to be when Robert went completely balls to the walls insane. I love that I say that as if living in pig shit and being in love with his mother wasn't insane up to this point. Nevertheless, though, it was throughout this time frame in his life that Robert really ramped up the amount of time and the amount of money that he was spending on sex workers. He'd pay them in either money or drugs to have sex with him, sure. But sometimes he just paid them to clean his trailer or to complete miscellaneous chores around the property. And while being hired just to clean up some hillbilly's messy trailer rather than to engage in the sex with him was probably a welcomed reprieve, there was nothing relaxing about the fact that from the late 70s through the early 2000s, at least 65 women were reported missing from the downtown east side. And sadly, because of these women's high-risk lifestyles, their careers, their socioeconomic status, what have you, whatever the case may be, their disappearances were either not taken very seriously or, in some cases, worse, they were just written off altogether. And eerily, this played right in to Robert's plans. He frequented East Hastings, Vancouver, as sort of his hunting ground for victims, likely for this reason. He knew that more than likely, if he preyed on people from this area and from this walk of life, the authorities, they just wouldn't care. And reprehensibly, he was right. Now, horrifyingly, there's no real way to know for sure when exactly Robert began his killing spree, but judging by what was gathered as far as intel and forensic evidence is concerned regarding his case, police were definitely able to date his killings all the way back to at least 1991. That said, though, it is highly likely that Robert was out running amok throughout Port Coquitlam far beyond that. There just wasn't any definitive forensic evidence ever found to prove that theory. Evidence or not, though, there are women that Robert is suspected of murdering dating back to like 79, I think was the earliest one I saw. And actually, I feel like that would make sense that his debut year was the year that his mom died. And given the rate at which women were disappearing, never to be seen again, I think we can all collectively agree that, like, he was probably killing way before the 90s. To give you some perspective, this epidemic of missing women was becoming so serious that by 1991, on Valentine's Day of that year, the people of Vancouver organized a march in order to press police to actually investigate the disappearances of these dozens of women that were disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side. And although Robert has only been implicated in the death of one victim in 1991, the death of Marianne Clark, I don't think that it's unrealistic to believe that he was likely responsible for way more than that. Marianne was just 25 when she went missing in August of 1991, and sadly she has never been seen or heard from ever again. And the number of women disappearing throughout the area would steadily increase over the following years, with nary a whisper of suspicion in Robert's direction, at least not from law enforcement. And actually what's really crazy is that in early 1995, police discovered the partial skull of one of Robert's victims, but because she was unidentifiable and no additional evidence was ever found, nothing really ever came of this discovery. As in, this woman is still unidentified to this day. The only reason that they were ever able to link this specific murder of this Jane Doe back to Robert was because later, when he was finally arrested, they found a few other skulls on his property that had clearly been handled in the exact same way that Jane Doe's skull had. And then later that same year, in December of 95, Diane Melnick disappeared, and her murder was later definitively linked to Robert via forensic evidence. Then in 1996, 23-year-old Tanya Holk was reported missing, later definitively being linked to Robert via forensics. That then brings us into 1997, and I don't know what got into Robert that year, but forensics gathered from his property was able to link him to the murder of 6 different women. 25-year-old Cara Louise Ellis, 24-year-old Sherry Leigh Irving, 25-year-old Andrea Faye Borhaven, 20-year-old Helen May Hallmark, 24-year-old Marnie Lee Ann Frey, and 43-year-old Cindy Felix. And remember, these are just the ones that we know of, because at this point, only God himself know the actual numbers. So basically what that boils down to is that over the span of just 3 years, Robert is believed to have taken the lives of no less than 8 women. Again, the real number is likely substantially higher, but I'm just going based off of the ones that have been conclusively proven or at least publicly linked to Robert, which by the end of 97, like I said, was 8 women. That said though, had Robert had his way, it would have been 9. Sandra Gail Ringwald, like Robert's other victims, was a working lady whom he picked up from Vancouver's Lower East Side. He coaxed her up into his shit wagon, and after promising to pay her handsomely, the two were off, making the 30-minute trek all the way back to his trailer. And things seemed pretty par for the course as far as what Sandra was used to, right up until the point where she had her back turned and Robert snuck up on her and slapped a handcuff onto one of her wrists. Thank God, though, that Robert, as we know, is an idiot, because he chose to attack Sandra within reach of a knife that he had just lying out there in the open. And you bet your bottom dollar, Sandra grabbed this knife immediately, and she proceeded to go full-on medieval on Robert's rat face. No, like literally, she stabbed him in the face. She stabbed him in the face so hard that she cut his jawbone and cracked some of his teeth. Yeah, badass. She also slashed his jugular. Yeah, she meant business. Now, unfortunately, this didn't take Robert down as quickly as one might hope. So even with the damage that he took on, he still managed to get the knife away from Sandra long enough to get a good few stabs into her as well. But thankfully, as he was just hemorrhaging all over the trailer, Sandra was able to get the knife back again before she just hightailed it the fuck up out of there. And not only did this absolute warrior of a woman manage to get away from this lunatic, but she managed to sprint across the property while holding her intestines in her hands. Yeah, man, some people are just built different. I'm ready to call it quits if I hit my funny bone too hard. Not this woman, though. This woman ran from Robert's trailer to the roadside and managed to flag down a car, all with her insides on the outside. And when she got in the car, she was so hell-bent on making sure that Robert didn't get away with what he had done to her that she mustered up every bit of strength that she had left to tell the couple that had picked her up that if she died, the guy that killed her lived in the trailer on that property. Again, badass. Thankfully, Sandra would not die. Against all odds, she managed to survive the attack, but regretfully, so did Robert. I know, right? Of course he did. What's really wild, though, is that he even ended up being treated for his injuries at the same hospital that Sandra was taken to. No, they never crossed paths, thank God, but just the idea that they were both under the same roof again later that same night, that is bananas. Obviously, police were called and Robert was questioned, but of course, he tried to turn the whole thing around and blame it all on Sandra. He told police that he had busted her trying to rob him and that then she had attacked him. So basically his attack on her was totally warranted because it was self-defense, just blah, 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 blah. Thankfully, despite his story, Robert was charged with attempted murder, but out of sheer terror, Sandra never showed up to testify at his trial. She was so scared that either Robert or David would come after her if she did speak out, that she just dipped. She refused to show up in court, and as a result, the charges were dropped, and Robert, he was a free man. Yeah, it's real disappointing. So while you chew on that, I'm gonna go ahead and take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, Robert, he just keeps on killing. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back. I'm still sick, and this guy still sucks. We're in 1998 at this point, and they're not gonna get better since coming back from our break. After managing to skirt justice for what he did to Sandra, Robert went on the following year to kill at least 4 additional women. Again, chances are it was probably more than that, as you're going to hear me say 1,000 more times today. But the ones that I'm going over here are the ones that he has been conclusively linked to. 38-year-old Carrie Lynn Koski, 46-year-old Inga Monique Hall, 29-year-old Sarah Jean DeVries, and 27-year-old Angela Rebecca Jardine. And that brings Robert's grand total at this point to 12 women. Yet, the Vancouver police publicly stated in 1998 that they did not believe that they had a serial killer on their hands.
Wrong.
It should go without saying that I'm obviously frustrated that they were able to so brazenly dismiss the disappearance of so many women, but then to go and make a spectacle of their misguided theory that there was no serial killer for these women to be on the lookout for. Not only are you I feel like instilling a false sense of security into the sex workers in this area, flat out telling them that there is not someone out there systematically picking them off one by one. But in a way, you're also instilling a sense of security into Robert. Like, oh, don't worry, pal. We are not onto you in the slightest. You keep on doing what you're doing. I don't know, man. It is deeply disheartening that the police, through these decades, were so quickly able to write off the deaths and the disappearances of so many women just because of the path that they chose to support themselves in life. Just because they chose a high-risk lifestyle, that means they're not worth protecting or seeking justice for? Gross. Here's a brilliant idea. How about we decriminalize sex work? We regulate it. We protect it. I can guarantee you, if the criminal implications were taken out of the sex work equation, then these women would not have had to lie low, hide their work, and basically live in the shadows. In my humble and unsolicited opinion, criminalizing sex work is dangerous for women. Flat out. When you have to sneak around for your livelihood, inherently, it is going to make it harder for police to protect you. Now, that's not to say that they should have been so fucking dismissive about it either way. The way this case was handled in particular was beyond appalling. But I can recognize that because these women were forced to fly under the radar, that it could have made it more difficult for police to look into their disappearances. Now, that does not excuse their complete and total lack of effort, because you're the police. You can't just ignore something because it's tricky. I guess their official excuse was that since they never found any bodies, they couldn't have possibly known that these women were being murdered, but whatever. Sorry, I'll digress because this is obviously a very nuanced topic with a lot of different talking points. Now, the Vancouver Police Board did post a $100,000 reward for any information that would have led to solving the case of these missing women, and I believe that that was offered sometime in 1999, all while, meanwhile, their not a serial killer was out robbing 4 more women of their lives. 22-year-old Jacqueline Michelle McDonald, 43-year-old Wendy Crawford, 28-year-old Jennifer Lynn Firminger, and 27-year-old Tiffany Louise Drew. Once again, all of these women were definitively linked to Robert years later via forensic evidence removed from his property. Oh, and then the following year, the police took a giant zero-gravity moon step backwards when they decided to scale back the size of the investigation that they had going on into all of these missing women. You know, all while Robert was out killing another 2, possibly 3 women. 32-year-old Brenda Ann Wolfe and 42-year-old Deborah Lynn Jones, both of whom disappeared in Y2K, were eventually conclusively linked to Robert via forensic material removed from his property. And then the maybe 3 stems from a woman named Dawn Teresa Cray, who was 42 years old when she too disappeared in 2000. Investigators have never been able to conclusively link her to Robert through forensic evidence, but it is widely believed that he is to blame for her disappearance and probable murder. But sure, let's scale back the investigation. That definitely seems like the right thing to do. By the way, if you've lost track, that is for sure 19 women, but maybe 21 women that Robert is responsible for murdering. It all just depends on if he really is responsible for the deaths of Marianne Clark and Dawn Teresa Cray. Mind you, while all of this was going on, police were receiving basically round-the-clock complaints from those whose properties neighbored the Picktons. Now, sadly, none of these complaints were about the missing women. I highly doubt the neighbors knew about that. But harder to keep a secret was the smell, appearance, and noise that came from Robert and David's property. These two men were seriously just the most derelict hillbillies that the human brain could possibly imagine. Just two completely low-down, wretched miscreants. Both of them, because David certainly did not clean his act up, pun intended, following the whole Tim Barrett experience. Yeah, no, the whole time that Robert was out on his spree of terror, his baby bro was also living his own life of crime. Be it violently attacking or attempting to SA women, be it trying to become a Hell's Angel. Truly, nothing was off limits to these two gigantic, dreadful pieces of shit. They literally opened up a makeshift nightclub on their disgusting property called Piggy Palace, where they hosted these enormous, wild, dirty parties damn near every night. Hence the constant noise complaints. Frustratingly though, these noise complaints always fell on deaf ears. Again, pun intended. And this was due to the fact that this upscale establishment was not only frequented by society's rejects, but it was also sometimes visited by people like mayors or members of city council, from high-up government officials all the way down to high school students. Evidently, it did not matter who you were. Anyone and everyone was welcome in some capacity or another at ye old Piggy Palace. Sidebar, yes, if you're wondering, I am aware that this story is absolutely fucking preposterous. The fact that I am talking about real people right now boggles the mind. Sometimes there could be upwards of 2,000 people crammed into this, like, tin tube, just raving and dancing and doing drugs. You know what I meant. Like, does this place not just sound like an absolute cesspool? There is no way you're getting out of one of these parties without needing antibiotics, a rabies shot, something, just even getting near it. Regardless of that, though, people loved it, I guess, because on a good night, Robert and David could pull in close to $50,000 just from being a place for people to hang out and cut loose. And that's not even taking into consideration a chop shop that they had set up on their property, and they had their meat business. So grotesque as these brothers were, they were managing to do incredibly well for themselves financially. Back to Piggy Palace, though, for a second. Is that whole concept not crazy that all of these people are partying alongside this deranged maniac and they had no idea? That is so scary. That is why I just stay home. Because what do they say? That the average person walks past like 36 murderers in their lifetime? Not me. Not unless they walking past my couch. Anyway, sorry, we left off at Y2K, so that brings us to 2001, which thankfully was the last year that Robert was free to rob women of their lives as he pleased. And you may be wondering by this point how word had not spread in some capacity or another through the ladies of the night that all of these women seem to have disappeared after being seen headed off with Robert, especially given what Sandra had gone through. Like, even if police weren't taking these disappearances seriously, word had to have spread enough through the East Side that Robert was dangerous to take on as a client, right? Well, 1000%, yes, it absolutely had. The problem with that, though, as previously stated, was that Robert had just so much money. Robert had enough money that even when he wasn't able to convince a woman to come back with him himself, he also had just these terrible women on a retainer, basically, that would then help him lure women away from downtown and back to his trailer. Isn't that disgusting? The fact that this man was able to find multiple women that were willing to help him brutalize and murder other women, that is just sick. Their names were Gina and Dina, by the way, in case you want to put a face and name to the additional people that you now hate from this story. Throughout Robert's final active year, it has been proven forensically that he took at least an additional 8 women's lives before he was finally stopped for good. 25-year-old Patricia Rose Johnson, 34-year-old Georgina Faith Papin, 27-year-old Heather Kathleen Bottomley, 30-year-old Heather Gabriel Chinnock, 22-year-old Andrea Joesbury, 29-year-old Serena Abbotsway, 26-year-old Mona Lee Wilson, and 34-year-old Diane Rosemary Rock. It's also widely believed that Robert is responsible for the disappearance and probable murder of 33-year-old Yvonne Marie Bowen that year as well. However, there's never been any forensic evidence discovered or presented to prove that definitively. Altogether, that is 27 women that we know for sure that Robert killed, as well as 3 women that we can't say for sure, but we're pretty sure. Plus, there's also women who have come forward in recent years claiming to have survived encounters with Robert, as well as other women who are speculated to have disappeared at Robert's hands. All while police sat around with their thumbs in their asses, doing nothing. Authorities didn't even end up with Robert on their radar in any kind of criminal way until early 2002. And even then, it still did not have anything to do with these missing women. They only ended up at Robert's property to follow up on a tip they received about illegal weapons being on the farm. Screw the dead girls. When illegal firearms come into play, they'll follow that up immediately. Ooh, that shit just chaps my ass, because police received some tips regarding Robert's potential involvement regarding the missing women, a ton over the years. The problem, though, was that they received so many tips that it would have been hard to look into all of them, so they didn't. But illegal weapons, that'll get them there post-haste. Who'd have thought that that was all it would have taken? Police descended onto the Pickton's property to execute their search warrant on February 5th, 2002. Again, they were solely on the property that day in search of the supposed illegal weapons that Robert was hoarding. But boy, did they get the surprise of a lifetime as they began ransacking his trailer. Sure, they found some weapons. Notably, I believe they found a shitload of knives. However, what really stuck out to them was a piece of paper that had Heather Bottomley's name on it. If you'll remember, she was one of the women that went missing the previous year, back in April of 2001. However, while that obviously raised some eyebrows and police definitely took notice, it wasn't exactly enough to send him to the gallows just yet. But when they subsequently found Serena Abbotsway's inhaler, also intermixed with Robert's things, well, let's just say that items belonging to 2 missing women, that was a lot more compelling than one item belonging to 1 missing woman. Serena Abbotsway had also gone missing back in August of the previous year. Robert was ultimately charged with a weapons offense on February 7th, 2002. However, this was mostly just a tactic to keep him locked up while they sealed off and began extensively searching his entire property. And although they definitely found some weird shit on Robert's property, pretty much in every direction they turned. Sex toys, pig carcasses, women's clothing, some jewelry, some sort of dildo, a gun. No, I'm not kidding. He, I guess, used it as a silencer of sorts. But even with all of these discoveries, it still took police 10 whole days of searching before they finally came across the first biological material that they could use to slap murder charges onto Robert. Ultimately, it would be Mona Wilson's blood that would be Robert's complete undoing. Mona had gone missing back in November of 2001, and she's actually believed to have been one of Robert's final victims, if not his final victim. But frustratingly, even with the discovery of this evidence, police were far from putting a bow onto Robert's case. Despite the hours and hours and hours of interviews and interrogations that Robert was subject to while he was being held by police, he refused to confess to any of the horrific and deplorable things that he had done. And what's even worse is that he was very clearly enjoying all of this newfound attention. He was so obviously proud of what he had done, even later stating that his only regret was that he got caught at 49 kills and that he didn't get to make it to the big 5-0. Unfortunately, though, even with as proud as he clearly was, he still did refuse to give police any sort of formal confession for weeks. Yes, for weeks. He put them through this dog and pony show, fucking misunderstood, innocent hick act before he would ultimately finally confess. Ugh, and his confession was so anticlimactic too. Just so completely mundane, as if he was talking about the weather. One of the cops confronted him about the sloppiness of one of his kills, and Robert, no shit, was just like, yeah, you got me. Yes, obviously I'm glad that he finally came clean, but then all those theatrics, for what? He was just a very disappointing excuse for a person. Any way you slice it. He's the worst. Oh, you know what else he did? He tried to tell police that he had totally planned to stop killing women once he had carried out one last murder. Because, he really wanted to get to that even 50. For some reason, that milestone was very important to him. Robert was then asked to identify his victims, to which he replied, no comment, before he then tried to negotiate with police. He tried to tell them that he would happily give up the names of his victims if, and only if, they agreed to immediately cease and desist the search of his property. Yeah, nice try, Bobby boy. Nice try. Sadly, though, for Robert, against his wishes, the search of his property, rather than halting post-confession, instead went on to become the largest forensic investigation in Canadian history up to that point. For nearly 2 years, hundreds of people, day in and day out, sifted through the unspeakable mess that was the Pickton's property, to the tune of $100 million, mind you. And honestly, in my opinion, these people are the heroes of this case. The forensic techs that were actually executing the search of Robert's property. These poor people had to sift by hand through decades and decades of not just regular disgusting filth, but also they had to sift through 20 years of pig shit. And you know what? As disgusting as it sounds, they happily did it. They showed up every day, all in the name of justice for these beautiful women who the Vancouver police and the RCMP had just branded as lesser than. So yes, bless the people who were tasked with that search, and just to the ones who allowed things to get this far. Throughout the entirety of this search, investigators discovered thousands of fragments of human remains, as well as just an unquantifiable amount of animal remains. Obviously, I could never possibly go through each and every piece of forensic evidence that they pulled from the Pickton's property. That would be insane. But some of the notable mentions are some buckets that they found with dissected skulls in them. These skulls were actually the ones that made them realize that Jane Doe's skull that had been discovered back in 95 had to have been one of Robert's victims. I guess they had been dissected or split in half the same way. Additionally, they found severed hands as well as severed feet. And buckle up for this one. In one of Robert's many freezers, police discovered multiple bags of ground meat, which were later confirmed via testing to not only be pork, but pork interspersed with ground up human flesh. This meant that homeboy was almost certainly selling minced up human meat to his customers, along with his pork products. I can imagine few more horrifying things than what it must have been like to live in this area at this time, to know that you bought meat from this maniac, and then to find out that it might have been human meat. How the fuck do you come to terms with that mentally? And I'm asking that as a third-party civilian, because there's also a chance that some of his victims' families could have possibly purchased or been given meat from him. I cannot fathom how you could ever begin to process that knowledge. That makes me physically fucking ill to think about. Yes, I know I make a lot of jokes throughout these videos. They are obviously only ever at the killer's expense, but I never want it to get lost that I really, really do feel so deeply saddened for these victims and for their families. Losing a loved one is truly such a heartbreaking experience, and losing someone unexpectedly is even worse. So losing someone unexpectedly and then finding out that this is how they met their fate, that this is the horror that they went through in their final moments, only to then have their body disrespected in such heinous ways. To find out that someone you loved was disposed of the same way as livestock? Yeah, don't worry, because we're gonna get there. But it is just the most unfathomable nightmare I think that a person could ever possibly find themselves in, to find out that all of this had happened to their loved one. Overall, Robert was charged initially with 27 counts of first-degree murder, heavy emphasis on initially. These were the 27 victims that police had recovered forensic evidence on, all the ones that we've covered throughout the course of this video. And while all of that sounds good, throw the book at this stank-ass motherfucker, unfortunately, the judge set to preside over Robert's case he must have had somewhere else to be. Not only did he decide that ultimately it was best to drop one of the charges altogether, but he also decided to split the remaining 26. And I bet you're thinking 13 and 13, right?
Wrong.
No, he decided that for the first trial, they would try Robert for 6 of his murders. 6 of them. 6. 6. But, that's fine. Right? Again, wrong. Because, okay, so best case scenario. Let's say that they do end up trying him for the remaining 20 at a later date, which, spoiler alert, they don't. But splitting the cases also kind of dampened the case that they did present, because they couldn't reference any of the other evidence from the other charges within the trial that they did have the courtesy to try. So yeah, it was a whole ass mess. I thought we had it rough down here in America, but apparently, Canada, y'all ain't much better. We really all just be out here on some bullshit, huh? Robert's trial began on January 30th, 2006, with, not surprisingly, Bobby pleading not guilty to all of his charges. Why not force these poor people's families to listen to all of the horrific details of what happened to their loved ones? Because, boy, did this trial bring to light some very disturbing insight into what truly happened to these poor women. According to testimony given by a friend of Robert's, whom reportedly he'd confessed to years before he was actually apprehended, Robert claimed he would pick up women from the east side in order to bring them back to his trailer for sex. This much we know. But then, apparently, as they were just about to finish the deed, Robert would grab their hands from behind and he would handcuff them before strangling them to death. Once they were gone, he would then take them and hang them upside down by hooks that he would insert into their ankles, and he would then slit their throats and allow them to bleed out into a bucket. Then, once their bodies were drained of their blood, he would fillet and dismember them, not dissimilar to the way that he would butcher his livestock. And as if it could not get worse, he would then feed a majority of his victims' bodies to his pigs. Yeah, Babe may be adorable and cute on the big screen, but in real life, under the right conditions, a pig can fuck you right up. Sure, pigs can make good pets, but at the end of the day, they're scavengers. When they're hungry enough, they will eat almost anything. And that includes, but is not limited to, human bones, soft tissue, and teeth. And with the amount of livestock that he had on the property, he basically had his very own built-in disposal system right in his very own backyard. And then anything the pigs might not want to eat, Robert would then just gather up and intermix with other animal scraps before then hauling it all down to the same animal processing plant that he took his regular animal parts to, ensuring that these parts would all be ground down together and destroyed, never to be seen again, and especially never to be traced back to him. I guess even with as dumb as Robert was, he did have at least a little bit of a brain in his head, because he did make sure to never take parts like heads or hands or feet to the processing plant, because those could obviously too easily be recognized as human. So I guess that also solves the mystery of all of the skulls and feet and hands police found in buckets all over his property. And while this first friend never actually witnessed anything Robert claimed to do, the same could not be said for Robert's friend Lynn, who also came out after Robert was arrested to share her eyewitness accounts of his madness. Lynn actually lived on the Pickton property for a while during some of the years that Robert was on his killing spree, and evidently one night she ended up walking into the barn to find Robert literally butchering a woman's body. Obviously, seeing this, Lynn freaked the fuck out, as you do. However, before she could get the hell out of there, Robert grabbed her and he forced her to stand there and watch him as he finished methodically and systematically breaking down this poor woman's body. And while he would later simply pay her off to keep her mouth shut, it was very much implied during the whole experience that if she did ever dare to speak up, Robert would ensure that she met the same fate as the woman that was currently on his table. And so, after that night, Lynn kept Robert's secret, just slamming back drugs and alcohol, basically all day, every day, just to try to cope with the horrible things that she had seen. Isn't it crazy how many people either knew or potentially knew what Robert was up to? And it still took police over 20 years to connect the dots and to trace these disappearances back to him. There was another lady, a woman named Tracy, who managed to talk Robert down when he tried to attack her. And then when they were driving home, he confessed to her, like everything. He told her all about how he had this silly little habit of murdering sex workers who didn't magically turn their lives around and get clean simply just at his behest.
Okay.
Back to the trial, though. In Robert's defense, his legal team went with basically the only defense they possibly could, which was that Robert was a simpleton who just was not mentally capable of carrying out these crimes as methodically as the prosecution was suggesting he had. Their strategy was that if Robert was guilty of anything, it was second-degree murder, not first. And they must have presented a pretty good argument, because brace yourselves. After deliberation, jurors returned, finding Robert guilty on all counts of second-degree murder, as the defense suggested, not first, as the prosecution had. Yeah, I don't know how you can commit the same murder 27 times if you go by forensics, 49 times if you go by Robert's own words. How you can commit the same crime so many times and it not be premeditated, but that's, I guess, none of my business. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years in 2007. So, given that he was arrested in 2002, that made him eligible for parole in 2027. Yes, as in 2.5 years from right now when I'm filming this. That 2027. Isn't that terrifying? Thankfully, though, I can guarantee you that he will never see a single day outside of a prison cell again. Because earlier this year, in May of 2024, he died. Well, actually, he was murdered, which ain't that poetic freaking justice? But yeah, he was attacked by another inmate and stabbed in the head with, like, a broken off broom handle or some shit. Following the attack, Robert was rushed to the hospital where he was placed in a medically induced coma before he finally passed away on May 31st, 2024. He was, I believe, 74 years old. And sure, you or I might find great pleasure in knowing that Robert died an incredibly painful and violent death, deservedly so, but it still pales in comparison to the horrible things that he did to his victims. It absolutely does not undo the pain and suffering that he caused to so many people, all because of the awful things that he did. I think one of the victims' family members summed it up best in their statement by saying, quote, "I guess he suffered at the end somewhere along the line, but he still, in my view, hasn't suffered enough for all the deaths that he caused and all of the women that are gone." I just can't believe that he was never tried for all of his victims. To mishandle the cases from the beginning like this, only to go on to let them slip once again through the proverbial cracks, to me is like pouring salt in the wound. Sure, police did eventually extend like a half-hearted apology to the public following Robert's arrest, stating that they could and should have caught him sooner, which you think. What I'm hearing here is that, by your own admission, you could have saved God knows how many lives had you just gotten off your asses and done something about this missing women epidemic. Good to know. Thanks for nothing. Now, supposedly the climate has changed in Canada now, as far as law enforcement is concerned. They claim that this was like a big wake-up call to them, and that now they understand that people from marginalized groups like this are actually more likely to fall victim to violent crime than their middle or upper-class counterparts. Meaning they now understand that these disappearances should be taken incredibly seriously and not just swept under the rug like they were in this case. I mean, it's pretty sad that it took countless dead women to get them to that conclusion, but better late than never, I guess. Following Robert's death, while going through his things, prison officials actually found a bunch of writings and notes that he had penned while incarcerated. And apparently, after giving the documents a once-over, it appears as though what they actually found was Robert's manuscript, eloquently titled Telling My Story. Now, at the time I'm filming this, these writings have never been released to the public, but from what I could gather, it seems like it was a pretty comprehensive account of all of his murders, which, if true, could help investigators link him to the additional 19 murders that he always claimed to have committed. Understandably, some of the families are desperately trying to prevent the release of this document to the public, arguing that they should get to read it themselves before anything else is done with it. I guess it was actually set to be released on Amazon earlier this year, which is wild to me, but it was pulled due to public backlash and outrage. And yeah, with that, you guys, we're about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to all of Robert's victims. I wish that I was able to tell you more about who each and every one of them were, because truly, their stories deserve to be so much more than just this. But sadly, comprehensive information about each of them just really isn't readily available out there to the public. At any rate, I hope they are all resting peacefully, and conversely, I hope that Robert is straight up roasting on a spit of his own in hell's hottest little corner for what he did to these poor women. And honestly, saying it out loud, even that sounds too good for him. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Of course, another big thank you goes out to Crystal for requesting it, because what a journey it was for all of us. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked in the description. And then if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the information and the links for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be somewhere on the screen for you here. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! So we're up north today. Of course, speaking... Nope. After dropping out of high school, Robert went on to secure... The Picktons had moved from the original farm sometime right around when Whoa, that was crazy. While old Bobby boy, he was relocated? No. Hello. Bloop. Oh, my throat and neck are so fucking swollen. You know I had swollen glands.
You know I had swollen glands!
Hence the constant ouch. Hence... Like, even if police weren't taking this 25-year-old Patricia... 25-year-old... 20... Am I okay? Send into the... I mean, there ain't enough contour in the world to contour out these swollen glands. All those three... But splitting the cases also kind of... Whoa. And then she died. Not surprisingly, Bobby pled guilty. Yeah.